Thank you all for coming tonight, giving me an opportunity to share my work with you. Newspaper making isn't play, declared Ida Johnson, Lula Walker, and Arizona Jackson in their February 1880 editorial in the Holocaust, a monthly published at the Seneca Indian School in Oklahoma. As this quote suggests, these three Native American schoolgirls took their printing of and editorial work with the Holocaust seriously and sought to transform the boarding school press by lending their voices and critical perspectives to it. That three young women assumed roles as printers and editors of their school newspaper at a time when such positions were limited for women and Native Americans, and especially limited for Native American girls, is worthy of attention. Whereas school authorities used periodicals to promote the missions of their institutions and to showcase the transformation of so-called savages into civilized students, the schoolgirl editors of the Holocaust had different intentions. In their first editorial in the inaugural December 1879 issue, Johnson, Walker, and Jackson announced their plan to use the Holocaust as a forum for serving their own interests and not strictly those of school authorities. Quote, "We desire and intend that the Holocaust shall represent the spirit of our school and always speak in behalf of its interest." They continued, "Supported directly by the Holocaust Society, it yet is intended to be a true exponent of the Seneca, Shawnee, and Wyandotte Industrial Boarding School, and a newsletter to the neighboring people as well as for the pupils. Their commitment to using the Holocaust as a vehicle for serving their community and preserving aspects of Native American cultures reflects a broader shift in how students learn to use the tools of the boarding school, their proficiency in English, access to new print technologies, and exposure to the dominant discourses on identity to pose challenges, albeit often subtle ones, to the assimilative policies and practices of the boarding school." In that same editorial, they also explain, quote, "Everything in getting out a paper is new to us. We never before attempted to write an editorial for printed paper or set up a line of type, and we never before expected to make so much pie in so short a time and do it so easily. The placement of the word pie, meaning type, in scare quotes seems designed to signal to readers that they are punning on the word pie, P-I-E. This is noteworthy, as it should suggest that these schoolgirls are moving into the unknown public space of a newspaper by linking their new work as printers and editors with the more traditional task associated with their domestic training at the school, baking or making pie. Studying the editorials and editorial commentary in the pages of the Holocaust illuminates how the schoolgirls negotiated their positions at the school and in the periodical press. The Holocaust belongs to a vast newspaper archive that remains largely understudied despite providing insight into how boarding school students employed the periodical as a powerful tool for writing against cultural erasure and serving the interests of Native communities. Writings by boarding school students and prominent Native American public intellectuals that appeared in boarding school newspapers have lacked critical attention and thus remain virtually unknown and unavailable to most scholars and students of Native American literature. My edited collection, Recovering Native American Writings in the Boarding School Press, fills this gap in the scholarship by making available a representative sampling of Native-authored letters, editorials, essays, short stories, and retold tales published in boarding school newspapers. By bringing visibility to forgotten or little-known writings by Native authors, my work hopes to contribute to scholarly recovery efforts that have helped reframe Native and American literary history. As literary scholar Susan Bernardine asserts in her essay, Alternate Origin Stories and Unexpected Archives, quote, "Accessing archives and making them accessible is crucial work in Native studies. The effects of doing so can prove transformative, whether by restoring knowledge traditions to tribal nations and communities, or by reframing understandings of diverse literary and intellectual histories. Such work is especially critical to exploring the complex networks that informed Native writers' literary production. By discussing some of the writings collected in my book, I hope to suggest that boarding school students demonstrated their agency by fashioning identities for themselves as printers, editors, and writers, and as such, they became vital participants in intertribal print networks, thus contributing to an expanding history of Native American literature. My paper highlights 2 newspapers that were printed and edited by students at federal boarding schools of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Seneca Indian Schools, the Holoquah, and Hampton Institute's Talks and Thoughts of the Hampton Indian Students. Boarding school newspapers, much like the schools themselves, were complex sites of negotiation. Writing for and editing boarding school newspapers, Native Americans developed multiple strategies to negotiate the different and sometimes competing demands and expectations of Native and non-Native audiences in order to gain visibility and the authority to speak. Before I examine the students' writings, I will provide a brief history of the schools. The Seneca Indian School was founded in 1871 in Wyandotte, Oklahoma, under the auspices of the Society of Friends. Children ages 4 through 18 attended the school, which initially offered a curriculum through the 4th grade, later expanding to the 8th and 9th grades in the 1920s. Classes began in spring 1872 with fewer than 50 students. The low enrollment reflected the resistance among Seneca, Shawnee, and Wyandotte parents to send their children away to boarding school. In 1876, the government began to assume a more active role in Indian education, and it oversaw all of the missionary schools in Indian Territory, including the Seneca Indian School. The purpose of reservation and off-reservation Native American boarding schools was largely the same: to provide Native American youth with the teachings of civilization in the form of a practical vocational education. In keeping with the civilizing mission of these schools, students were first taught how to speak, read, and write in English. When the Seneca Indian School opened in 1872, the local agent, Hiram Jones, reported, quote, "School was opened. I believe too much importance cannot be attached to the work of educating the Indian children, both in literary attainments and in industrial pursuits. The work of civilization and the future of the Indian race depend in great measure on this." Jones explained that the school was designed to teach students English and academic subjects, as well as offer them vocational training. As soon as students understood English, they were to begin studying other academic subjects like math, geography, and U.S. history. But the emphasis at reservation and non-reservation schools was always on vocational training designed with the intention of preparing Native American youth to become self-sufficient workers. Students spent approximately half a day in the classroom and the rest of the time on vocational or work details, which reflected the strict sex segregation and division of labor enforced at the schools. While boys learned how to use tools and acquired skills associated with blacksmithing, woodworking, and carpentry, girls were trained in cooking, sewing, laundering, and other domestic skills designed to prepare them to become housekeepers and housewives. It is worth noting that domestic training for girls marked a shift in approach to Indian education that occurred in the mid-19th century. Whereas earlier the emphasis had been on educating Native American boys and men, missionaries and the federal government began to recruit girls in response to the popular belief that women must be educated to raise virtuous male citizens. Many school authorities believed that Native American girls were essential to the civilizing mission of boarding schools. Expressing this view, Isaiah Baird, who served at a mission boarding school in Wisconsin, asserted, The girls will need the training more than the boys, and they will wield a greater influence in the future. If we get the girls, we get the race. Richard Henry Pratt, founder of the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania, which became the prototype for federal off-reservation boarding schools across the United States, conveyed a similar sentiment in his annual report to the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, emphasizing the importance of domestic training for Indian girls. Of what avail is it that the man be hard-working and industrious, providing by his labor food and clothing for his household, if the wife, unskilled in cookery, unused to the needle, with no habits of order or neatness, makes what might be a cheerful, happy home only a wretched abode of filth and squalor? Pratt's remark reflects the commonly held belief at the time that Native American women were careless, dirty, and unfamiliar with the concept of hard work. Pratt sought to assuage white fears that Carlisle graduates would revert to traditional ways of living or return to the blanket by highlighting how the girls' program at Carlisle trained each Native American girl to become, quote, a good housekeeper. Pratt's ideas were shared by other school authorities, including Andrew Atchison, superintendent of the Seneca Indian School. In Atchison's 1891 annual report of the Commissioner of Indian Affairs to the Secretary of the Interior, he writes, quote, a large number of young men are fairly qualified for the management of farm work, and everywhere in the door, yards, and dwelling houses and dress of the people may be seen the evidences of education among the women. Indeed, the education of a girl is what is worth much more to the cause of Indian civilization than that of a boy. As Atchison's report suggests, by the 1890s, federal boarding schools were committed to training Native American girls and young women to become housewives who would help their mates assimilate and pass the lessons of civilization on to their children. As K. Sinanina Lomawema explains, the emphasis on manual labor at boarding schools reflected a late 19th century racist ideology that assumed Native Americans had ostensibly lower intellectual capabilities than whites. One of the Holocaust contemporaries, the Indian Helper, published a poem titled The Girls That Are Wanted in its March 25, 1887 issue that illustrates how boarding school authorities sought to reinforce the emphasis on domesticity training by encouraging Native American female students to become domestic workers. The poem reads, the girls that are wanted are wise girls that know what to do and to say, that drive with a smile or soft word the wrath of the household away. The girls that are wanted are girls of sense, whom fashion can never deceive, who can follow whatever is pretty and dare what is silly to leave. The girls that are wanted are careful girls who count what a thing will cost, who use with a prudent, generous hand, but see that nothing is lost. The clever, the witty, the brilliant girls, they are very few understand, but oh, for the wise, loving home girls, there's a constant and steady demand. Resembling an advertisement for domestic employment, the poem insists that the young women who are wanted for domestic work are those loving home girls or housewives who have skillfully learned the skills their domestic training was designed to teach them. The poem also indicates that those who are wanted are girls who have embraced the lessons of neatness, order, and economy, for without a practical knowledge of all these, she cannot make a home or become a good housekeeper. The speaker's optimistic tone and insistence on there being a constant and steady demand for domestics obscure a much bleaker reality. Although the speaker acknowledges that there are clever, witty, and brilliant Native girls, the poem suggests that they are the exception and not the rule. The poem ultimately seeks to discourage Native American girls from aspiring to jobs that foster intellectual self-expression, like editing and writing. The Girls That Are Wanted exemplifies how school authorities sought to remake Native American girls and young women into subservient housekeepers through the reading of newspapers like the Indian Helper. As Jessica Enoch explains, the Indian helper functioned first and foremost as a pedagogical tool by teaching current and former Carlisle students the rules of etiquette, English, and white behavior, reinforcing the pedagogical objectives learned in the classroom. School authorities also aim to use the Indian helper as a disciplinary and surveillance device to keep Native American girls in their proper place. In this way, the Indian helper and other white-edited school newspapers reinforced the general non-Native belief that a woman's place was in the home. From the first issue of the Holoquah, it is clear that the editors sought to use their newspaper to define themselves in ways that were at odds with the school's civilizing mission. In fact, one of the most distinctive features of the Holoquah that makes it unique among boarding school newspapers is that its editors, Ida Johnson, Lula Walker, and Arizona Jackson, used the editorial we to create a collaborative space and render visible the often hidden editorial practices of newspaper making in the context of the boarding school. Employing the editorial we enabled the editors to reflect, sometimes critically, on a boarding school education designed to train young Native women to become domestics and housewives, not professional printers, writers, and editors. Their early editorial remark that newspaper making isn't play suggests they understood that the periodical was a powerful tool they could use to expand women's roles and serve Native communities. The Holoquah is thus an excellent case study for better understanding the gendered dimensions of editorial work and what that meant for young Native women in the context of the boarding school. In the pages of the Holoquah, the editors assumed an editorial we, similar to the sisterly editorial voice that Patricia Oker associates with women-edited periodicals in the 19th century. This voice, according to Oker, is characterized by a relative informality and an assumed equal and personal relationship between editor and reader. Like women editors who adopted a sisterly editorial voice in order to present readers, writers, and editors as equally important participants in a periodical conversation, the editors of the Holoquah sought to create a conversational space for themselves and their readers, fellow students, teachers, and members of the local community. Significantly, the editorial voice in the Holoquah is markedly different than the editorial voice we hear, for example, in one of the Holoquah's better-known contemporaries, the Carlisle Indian School's Indian Helper, in which white adults speak, Native American girls listen. The voice we hear in the Indian Helper is not that of Native American girls, but rather the voice of the man on the bandstand, a white male persona who claimed editorship of the Indian Helper. His use of the editorial we creates a sense of cohesion between himself and his female students. By speaking for his students, he gives the impression that they share his worldview and eagerly accept his denigration of Native American cultural traditions. When Johnson, Walker, and Jackson use the editorial we in the Holoquah, however, they embrace their cultural heritages and challenge the notion that being boarding school students meant they were no longer Indian. Their early editorials reveal their insecurities about being judged as printers and editors in a public forum at a time when such roles were limited for women and Native Americans. In their inaugural December 1879 editorial, they asked their readers to overlook their imperfections, emulating women editors who, especially in first issues, asked readers for indulgence while the magazine finds its legs, as it were. Such appeals suggest Johnson, Walker, and Jackson's awareness of 19th century women's editorial conventions and their interest in being taken seriously by Native and non-Native readers as they sought to create a collaborative and conversational space. In double number, they explain that various delays too tedious to mention caused them to postpone the March issue until April. And they express disappointment with the issue and vow, quote, "We may never try it again." They printed an impressive 300 copies of the double number, which consisted of 8 pages with 2 columns each, twice the length of a regular issue. Yet they repeatedly emphasized their disappointment with the results. "We would be willing to write a long apology for the imperfect printing of our paper if that would make it any better." Their repeated apologies for delays and emphasis on how hard they work to perfect their craft without the influence of teachers reflects their pride in their accomplishments as editors and printers. Their editorials also reveal that collaboration does not always translate into sharing the labor of newspaper making. As they explain in their March-April editorial, the absence of 2 of the editors meant that one editor had to do the bulk of the work, resulting in a late issue, commentary that troubles the assumed seamlessness of the editorial we and the division of labor. Even as they gained more experience with newspaper making, they faced other challenges resulting from the demands of the domestic labor they were required to perform at the school. At the Seneca Indian School and similar boarding schools, where the aim of female education was to train students to become housewives and domestic workers, young women were expected to cook, clean, and wash laundry, sew, and nurse sick classmates and teachers. Within this context, editorials appealing to readers to forgive them for late issues resulting from their domestic duties, along with their critical commentary, pose a challenge, however subtle, to a domestic education designed to train young Native women to become housewives and housekeepers, not professional editors and writers. Editorials like the one that appeared in the May 1880 issue of the Holocaust provide insight into how the editors responded to the demands of the domestic labor they were required to perform and its impact on their newspaper making. After this issue of the Holocaust, there will be but one more number of this volume. We had thought that every number we had published that the next would be easier, but each time we find new difficulties to overcome, and as 2 of the editors are away this time, there is more work for one to do than usual, and that is somewhat mixed up with tonic powders, quinine, and about 50 girls to look after. A note appearing below the editorial explains that Jackson was again at her desk after an absence of 3 weeks caused by sickness, revealing that she assumed responsibility for finishing the issue while Johnson and Walker were away. Once again, we see Jackson picking up the slack, but what is notable in this editorial is that she offers a critical response to the domestic ideology of the boarding school, where she and her female classmates were being trained first and foremost to become submissive domestics. Jackson resists, albeit subtly, the definitions imposed on her by the domestic ideology of the school. As we see in the editorial, Jackson defines her work primarily as her editorship of the Holocaust, not her domestic tasks, and suggests that her editing is somewhat mixed up with her domestic labor. In this way, she prioritizes her editorial work and downplays her domestic tasks, a move that enacts a challenge to the policies and practices of the boarding school. In their editorial commentary, they also remark on their domestic training. One of the large girls is staying out of school this week to help the seamstress, and 3 are out helping the laundress. Next week will be the time for some of us to take their places. Explaining the various domestic tasks they performed at the school, they continue, "We each have our different kinds of work, such as cooking, washing dishes, etc. Matron changes the detail every 2 weeks for such as that. But we have to stay out of school 1 week at a time to sew and wash, while our other work does not keep us out at all." The editors point out that, unlike sewing and washing, their other work does not disrupt their schoolwork. Even though the passage suggests that their other work refers to domestic tasks like cooking and washing dishes, it is possible they could also mean their printing and editing of the Holocaust and the experience of teaching themselves how to set type and write copy, among other skills. When read in this way, the passage might suggest that the editors viewed their domestic labor, or some forms of it, as more disruptive to their schooling and likely less fulfilling than their newspaper making. Such a reading opens up the possibility that the editors are not only offering their critical perspectives on their domestic training, but that they are also combating the underlying assumption that such training was befitting Native American female students who were believed to lack the intellectual capacity to learn and achieve academically and professionally. As the editorials and commentary demonstrate, the editors confronted innumerable challenges in getting out each issue. Absences among the editorial staff due to illness were common. The editors nursed their sick classmates and routinely assisted the laundress, seamstress, and cook. Other delays resulted from inadequate funding that plagued the newspaper and the school as a whole. Despite the various challenges they faced, from inadequate supplies to illness and even death among the editorial staff, and their frequent apologies for late issues and comments about the needs for improvement, the editors produced what Native press historians Daniel F. Littlefield Jr. and James W. Perrins aptly describe as a remarkably professional newspaper, when it is considered that the editors were nearly entirely self-taught. Recovering the editorials and editorial commentary in the Tahlequah provides insight into how Johnson, Walker, and Jackson asserted their public authority as they negotiated their roles at the school and in the press, making it an invaluable resource for scholars working to recover early indigenous literary production and to complicate our understanding of editorial decision-making in boarding school newspapers. So this photo, in case you're wondering, is of my thumb. I wanted you, the first time I saw the Tahlequah in person, I was very excited, but also very surprised to see how small it was, because I had only seen it digitally before then. So I wanted to document, and I asked the archivist, is it okay if I take a picture with my thumb? There was nothing else that I could put next to it at the time. But that gives you a sense of how small it was. And I'm missing a slide. Where did my other slide go? Okay, well, I don't know. Maybe it's somewhere else. Keep plugging along. 7 years after the Tahlequah was founded at the Seneca Indian School, the members of the Indian Literary Club at Hampton Institute in Virginia released the first issue of their student-run school newspaper, Talks and Thoughts of the Hampton Indian Students. The monthly, which had a more than 20-year run, typically consisted of 4 pages with 2 columns each and sometimes expanded to 8 pages. Talks and Thoughts contained items of general interest to the school, updates on student clubs and organizations, the results of student contests and news stories, as well as autobiographical accounts, essays, letters, and retold tales. Here I highlight writings by 2 Hampton students, Elizabeth Bender and Harry Hand, that appeared in Talks and Thoughts. Bender's writings reveal her interest in writing back to non-native readers by challenging the myth of the vanishing Indian. Hand preserves literary and artistic traditions in the pages of the newspaper to counter the white-conceived notion of the Indian as primitive and to remind native readers of their achievements as a race. Together, their writings affirmed their native cultural identities, thus undermining the idea that being educated at Hampton meant they were no longer Indian. By calling attention to Bender's and Hand's writings, I suggest ways of complicating our understanding of student agency and asserting the importance of boarding school newspapers to the expanding canon of early Native American literature. Although the boarding school experience was, in the words of historian David Wallace Adams, an education for extinction, Hampton Institute, unlike other boarding schools, encouraged students to maintain something of their tribal heritage. In 1878, Samuel Chapman Armstrong opened the doors of Hampton Institute in Virginia, founded in 1868 to provide former slaves with a vocational education, to its first class of Indian students, recently released prisoners from Fort Marion in Florida. By the time Elizabeth Bender, a Chippewa from the White Earth Reservation in Minnesota, entered Hampton Institute's Indian program in 1903, the Indian School Service and the Bureau of Indian Affairs more generally had shifted away from a policy of total assimilation toward one that encouraged retaining some aspects of culture, particularly if they could be commodified. In one of the essays she contributed to Talks and Thoughts, Elizabeth describes a trip she took with her sister Anna from Hampton to New York. As Elizabeth explains in her essay, she and Anna were not simply on a sightseeing trip. They were chosen to go north to sing Ojibwe songs and speak at parlor meetings for the benefit of Hampton. Even though the school authorities wanted to emphasize that students were being successfully civilized, they often referenced the tribal past of students and displayed them as exemplars or objects whenever it proved financially beneficial for the schools. There are several possible reasons why Elizabeth and Anna were chosen to represent Hampton's Indian program. They both excelled academically, were active in a number of organizations, including the Josephines, a female literary society, and published their writings in the school's student-run Talks and Thoughts. From the perspective of school authorities, exemplary students like Elizabeth and Anna were a walking testament to Hampton's Indian program. For students like Elizabeth Bender, being an educated Indian meant challenging the notion of the vanishing Indian with their own counter-representations of Native Americans as capable of change. She represents her people in a moment of transition in the land of Hiawatha, an essay that appeared in the June 1907 issue of Talks and Thoughts. She subtly disrupts the discourse of the vanishing Indian celebrated in Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's poem, The Song of Hiawatha, by representing the Chippewas not as disappearing culturally, but rather as capable of change. Her negotiation between a desire to preserve Ojibwe traditions and an embrace of cultural change becomes more complex towards the end of the essay, as she mentions the inevitable passing of old ways, meaning hunting and gathering, and praises civilization with cozy homes and well-kept farms. Bender embraces the transformation of a hunter-gatherer culture to an agricultural one, and speaks positively of her tribe's transition to farming. Quote, most of the Chippewas are engaged in farming and are quite industrious. The reservation life has somewhat retarded their progress, but in spite of obstacles and hardships, they are making a brave struggle. By emphasizing that Indians could change and were changing, Bender challenges the myth of the vanishing Indian, while at the same time she insists that Chippewas are retaining their cultural ties. She also criticizes the reservation system for limiting their progress, a theme that recurs in writings by Native American public intellectuals at the time. Besides Bender, other student contributors to Talks and Thoughts challenge representations of Indian cultures as vanishing by asserting the relevance of indigenous literary and artistic traditions to Native communities. Students like Harry Hand, Joseph Dubray, and Anna Bender transcribed oral traditions into English and then recreated them in print in Talks and Thoughts. The students' retold tales often depict how stories are passed down from a revered storyteller to the younger generation. By retelling oral traditions in boarding school newspapers, these writers contribute to the efforts of more well-known writers like Frances LaFleche and Gertrude Bonin, who sought to preserve oral traditions for future generations of Native Americans while educating white readers about the value of their tribal cultures. Harry Hand, a Crow Creek Sioux, was a regular contributor to Talks and Thoughts. He entered Hampton in 1889 at 18 after spending 6 years at the Crow Creek Agency School. Hand wrote stories about war and hunting that were passed down from his elders. According to historian Jacqueline Emery, through Hand's efforts, these stories were, for the first time, presented in the English language, in written form, and illustrated with his own neat drawings. Besides highlighting the importance of the art of storytelling to Native education, Hand's writings and illustrations bring into focus how boarding school students use the periodical press to preserve in print the oral and pictorial traditions of Native American cultures. In one of his stories, Hand describes the importance of the storyteller to Native American culture. In the evening after supper, the men would get together, bring their pipes with their long stems and knick-knack bags, sit in a circle and smoke, while one of the group would tell a story of war or hunting. When they have this, if there are any children present, the old Indian would say, "Now children, you listen, so that you will see what I ought to have done, so that if you ever meet with the same thing, you can remember what I said, so that you can improve on them." Hand's recreation of the storytelling scene underscores the importance of the storyteller to the education of Native American children. The storyteller is a revered pedagogue who teaches the children lessons as well as how to manipulate language. Hand's description of the pedagogical function of storytelling challenged the widely held belief among whites that Native Americans did not have their own system of education. This was a significant argument to make in a newspaper printed at an off-reservation boarding school, where it was often mistakenly assumed that white teachers were the first to educate their pupils. As historian Margaret Connell-Saz observes, Native American children were far from the blank slates boarding school authorities often mistook them for. Through a Native education, they were taught endurance and patience, and they committed stories and other knowledge to memory. In addition to recognizing the importance of the storyteller to the education of Native American children, Hand represents this figure as an artist whose stories, if gathered and translated by a good translator and published in book form, would compare favorably with Arabian Nights. By assigning the storyteller a literary standing, Hand points to the significance of the oral tradition to Native American self-expression and knowledge. However, Hand acknowledges the limitations of the oral tradition in a world dominated by print. Quote, "We have read of many adventures of white people among Indians, but we never read of adventures told by Indians among white people. Why? Because the Indians have no newspaper through which to let the reading public know their side of many stories." Hand emphasizes how important newspapers are to exerting control over how Native Americans are represented in print. Hampton taught him that the periodical press was a powerful tool Native Americans could exploit in order to let the public know their side of the story. Moreover, as Hand's contributions to the school newspaper reveal, Native Americans could use the periodical press as a forum to preserve not only an oral tradition, but a pictorial tradition as well. Many of Hand's stories were accompanied by illustrations, most of which portrayed scenes from Native life. Hand's illustrations reveal that he inherited the Plains pictorial tradition and subscribed to some of its conventions. For example, he provides no horizon or setting beyond what is specific to the story, as is common in the Plains pictorial tradition. Hand's attention to details, a necessary feature of the Plains pictorial tradition, is also evident in the teepee headdresses and pipe. Moreover, Hand's illustration represents action, denoted here by the storyteller's raised hands, which reflects the narrative form of the Plains pictorial tradition. Hand's illustrations were often printed on the front page of Talks and Thoughts. It is likely that the student editors wanted to draw attention to these illustrations because they offered a glimpse of Native culture. Samuel Chapman Armstrong, the founder of Hampton, even encouraged students to publish their illustrations in the newspaper and to sell their artwork to white visitors to the school. It is worth noting, however, that it was not common practice for the editors to print illustrations on the front page of the newspaper. In fact, Hand was one of the only illustrators whose work appeared regularly in the newspaper. His distinctive illustrations anticipate the work of professional illustrators like Winnebago Angel DeCora, who illustrated several books, including Francis LaFlèche's The Middle Five and Zakala Shah's Old Indian Legends. DeCora taught Indian art at Carlisle from 1906 to 1915, during which time she worked to cultivate and preserve her native students' artistic talents and promoted the value of Indian art to American art. Like DeCora and other professional native illustrators, Hand sought to preserve and extend indigenous illustrations into U.S. print culture. After leaving Hampton in 1894, Hand returned to the Crow Creek Reservation, where he founded his own newspapers, the Crow Creek Herald and the Crow Creek Chief, which published news about Crow Creek returnees and commented on broader issues that influenced Indian affairs in South Dakota. Although Hand died in 1899, only 1 year after he founded the Chief, his ambition to serve his community by starting his own newspapers speaks volumes about his belief in the power of the periodical press to offer Native Americans a chance to participate in and shape public conversations on indigenous issues. Hand, Bender, and the editors of the Holoquah, as well as more well-known Native public intellectuals like Gertrude Bonin, Angel DeCora, Charles Eastman, and Carlos Montezuma, recognized early on that boarding school newspapers and Native-edited periodicals provided the best venues for reaching a mixed audience of Native and non-Native readers. As the writings this essay samples demonstrate, boarding school students use their English language literacy in ways that at times may have supported the assimilationist goals of the boarding schools and that were at other times unanticipated by school authorities and at odds with the school's civilizing mission. Many also used boarding school newspapers not only for self-expression, but also for asserting their commitment to Native Americans, Native American communities, and to change. This understudied periodical archive is an untapped resource for scholars working to recover early indigenous writings and to challenge the assimilationist resistance binary that has dominated narratives of the boarding school experience. Thank you.
The physical objects of these papers you've been discovering. It looks like you've been able to have some of them in your hand and see them. But are they accessible physically, or are they kept? How many were preserved?
So for my book, I mined roughly 10 newspapers. And those that I selected were the ones that had fuller runs that I could access in archives. I conducted a lot of my research at the New York Public Library. As you saw in one of my notes, that's the library that has the most comprehensive run of talks and thoughts, but it's literally crumbling, falling apart. Some of the other archives I visited were at the Historical Society in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, at the Museum of Natural History here in the city. I also went to Washington, D.C. to the Smithsonian where I did research. So it's a mix. And I got to see some of them in print runs of some of the newspapers, and others like the Holoquah I hadn't seen in print until I saw that one issue that's available at the American Antiquarian Society in Worcester. Yeah, so it's a mix, and not many of these have been digitized at this point. So I'm hoping that by calling attention to these archives, that will spur more efforts to digitize them. It means star. Yeah, and one of the interesting things about these newspapers is that the editors, even the student editors, were reading each other's newspapers and commenting on them. And Arizona Jackson had a letter she had written, a benefactor, and that letter was published on the front page of a Carlisle newspaper. I don't know how it got there, whether she submitted the letter for publication, whether the Quaker woman, Susan Longstreth, who was the benefactress, whether she submitted, I don't know how it got there, but it was one of those amazing finds after spending hours in the library just looking through newspapers to come across that. I felt like I was back in kindergarten on Christmas morning. Like, it was amazing to find that. And so, yeah, they had subscribers, but the school itself, the Seneca school itself, had a very troubled past, and there was a lot of sickness, a lot of outbreaks of malaria, tuberculosis. It was not a well-maintained school, although it was in existence for quite some time. And the Holocaust only lasted 2 years, so it had a much shorter run compared to, say, Talks and Thoughts. And Hampton itself had more robust funding through the government. The federal government would pay X amount of dollars per student. So the more students, the more money. And I think the largest class at the Seneca Indian School was like under 200 students.
And then just to follow up, were there mainly female writers for the Holocaust versus Talks and Thoughts being enhanced and being written?
So Talks and Thoughts had a 20-some-odd year run, and there were a lot of editors at a time, and they were both male and female students. In fact, Angel Decora, who went on to become a teacher, an art teacher at Carlisle, she was an editor very early on. But that's one of the things that makes the Holocaust so distinctive, is because it was three female students who founded it, so that's very unusual. Okay.
Yeah, one of the things that you mentioned at the end, you talked about the assimilation resistance binary. And I was wondering if you could talk more about how that binary has been used to discuss Native Americans in English or in history or whatever kind of literature you're reading, and then how your work engages with that binary.
So one of the interventions of my work is to say that boarding school newspapers and even student-edited newspapers have traditionally been written off as assimilationist. And so I look at these writings and I see students not merely echoing the assimilationist rhetoric of school officials or school authorities. Some of them do, but some of them do, but they also are talking about their tribal traditions, or they're using the we in a way that is emphasizing community. These schools were designed to break up tribal communities. So when students are referencing a tribal past, when they're talking about oral traditions, when they're talking about an indigenous community, I think those are ways that they're pushing back against that assimilationist drive. There have been many historians and literary scholars who have published and reprinted, but also have published scholarship on boarding school narratives. The majority of those narratives were written by former students. So there's a trend in the scholarship to take a second look, a closer look at those narratives, and to see how students are not simply espousing an assimilationist rhetoric or being completely resisting that, but taking sort of a middle ground. And I see that too in the writings that students were publishing while they were at school.
It's interesting, like the creation of the translation of the oral histories that they're putting in, or the images that they're putting in to the newspaper. It seems like an effort to create an archive to capture the past and preserve it in a way. Do you feel that that was conscious? Are they deliberately trying to create an archive for posterity?
I think they were. And I think, so folks who read my scholarship or who have had access to some of these materials will sometimes argue that, they'll say, well, ultimately the school authorities were the ones who were censoring and were making decisions about what went into these newspapers. And yes, that is a piece of this that we can't lose sight of, right? And we'll never know to what extent did the man on the bandstand, who often is assumed to be Pratt himself, or Mariana Burgess, who managed the printing office at the Carlisle Indian School, to what extent did they intervene, even in the student-edited newspapers? We will never know, just as we don't know what happens in the New York Times, right? That's true of all periodicals, of all texts, right? And so I think that when the students, I think in the case of Talks and Thoughts, Samuel Armstrong wanted to raise funds for the school, wanted to promote cultural traditions, and he was more open to it, and that's why we have this newspaper, I think. But the students, I would also argue, are interested in preserving. Harry Hand certainly understood the importance of preserving native oral traditions in print, and his illustrations.
Are there other native periodicals outside the boarding school, like reservations and things? How do they compare with what you see in the boarding school?
So I haven't looked at many of them. There were, so many of the graduates of these schools went on to found the Society of American Indians, and they had their own periodicals, so I've looked at those periodicals, and they're much more sophisticated in terms of content.
Do they push back against this kind of?
Yeah, and there's also this negotiation happening, and a lot of them were, back. It's only sort of recently, like in this century, that scholars are now saying, wait a minute, we've written these red progressives off. We've written them off as assimilationist. Let's take another look at them and contextualize them. They are not perfect. And some of them supported the Dawes Acts or the breaking up of tribal communities. And then later regretted that, right? And so there's a lot of give and take, a lot of push and pull, and so they're very complex texts. They need to be read.
Yeah.
Related to that, methodologically, how do you decide when there's a mixed message going on? Partly assimilation, partly traditionalist or resistance. How do you decide what's uppermost and whether people are pushing or getting pushed? It seems to be a difficult issue to get your mind around, and the only way I can just kind of feel, well, I think this is going on. Are there any rules for approaching it?
No
I
rule.
don't mean rules that
I make up my role, my own. Yeah. A lot of it is, how would I describe this methodologically? I read each each text with multiple layers. So what were, I'm thinking about what were the school authorities thinking about some of these issues? How were they presenting these types of texts? What were they saying in their publications versus what the students are saying? And I guess some of it could come down to feeling. I just get a feeling about what they're saying, and I'm not looking in necessarily at intentions, right? Like what intentionality, but rather those moments when they seem to be suggesting or asserting a self-definition, right? Or asserting a sense of community, or asserting asserting or on the flip side, asserting an interest in giving up all of their Indianness and assimilating completely into the dominant culture. I've been really throughout, this is a more than 10-year project, so the book draws on my dissertation research, and I've over the years have gone back and forth about these texts. I remember after my dissertation defense, my fourth reader saying, "You present too happy of a picture." So I feel like I've been I've gotten feedback from various people over the years and different perspectives, and I've tried to take that into account. Not to present too happy of a picture, but also not to overlook those moments of resistance or those moments of assimilation. They're often happening in the same text, and I'm okay with that. I see those narratives happening simultaneously. So my goal is not to eliminate or silence one of them, but to present them both. Joseph, you had your hand up a while ago. Do you still have a question?
You went into how long the project, you said over a decade?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.